So according to my clock, it's 3:59 a.m. in Seoul, Korea, and 2:59 here in Boston. I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the IDA webinar series. My name is Rob Thornton. I'm the president and CEO of the International District Energy Association. I'll serve as moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, our focus for today is microgrids for a more resilient California. And before we begin, I'd like to just handle a little bit of housekeeping and logistics. Emily? This free webinar is a series underwritten in part by IDA's annual sustaining sponsors. I thank them for their ongoing support. The organizations include Clearway Energy, NG, Johnson Controls, Solar Turbines, Thermo Systems, and Train. Really, they help us continue our mission of advancing, informing, and connecting the industry. Emily? So we're holding this webinar on Zoom, and some format suggestions. All of the attendees have been muted. We had over 360 people registered, so that would be a cacophony. We would suggest, though, that you submit your questions as we go. The format will have a presentation by our panelists, and then at the conclusion of their remarks, we'll certainly have time for Q&A, and we'll moderate the questions as they at that time, and we'll keep track as they come in. So please submit in the Q&A box, and if anyone's having a challenge with either audio or video, please use the chat and send that to Emily Brascala. She's our host. And again, for housekeeping, the webinar will be recorded and downloaded and available as streaming after the fact, and the slides will also be available in PDF format. And so anyone who's registered for the webinar will be receiving those links on conclusion. I think there's also a brief survey at the end, if you might just take a minute to help us plan future events. So next, our agenda, we'll just have a brief overview of the Microgrid Resources Coalition mission and membership. I'll then introduce our panelists and hand it over to them. We'll do a little bit of background on where we've been in terms of California microgrid policy. This has been work that the MRC has been engaged in for nearly a year, if not longer. And then we'll cover kind of where we are today in this sort of confusing period of COVID. But there's still a lot to be done and a lot to consider. We've got an hour at least planned for this webinar. We can extend to 90 minutes if questions and discussion require. So again, please submit your questions as we go, and we'll try to make time to address them at conclusion of the presentation. If not, we'll also provide the contact information for our panelists. If you'd like to follow up for a deeper dive discussion, you'll certainly know how to do that. Next, so the Microgrid Resources Coalition was formed in 2014. It's a nonprofit coalition with a board of directors and executive committee. It's managed by staff here at the International District Energy Association. The mission of the MRC is to promote widespread implementation of microgrids through policy and regulatory reforms that recognize and value microgrid services for resilience and grid support. So apologies for reading aloud, but just a little bit, MRC is essentially a nonprofit, and it is very much a nonprofit. And all the net proceeds of dues and conference net proceeds are totally reinvested in advocacy. This organization is not profit seeking, and that advocacy takes place at both federal, state, municipal, provincial, and as needed at a local or agency level. So our focus today is really California. Our lens is zeroed in on California. and what we've been doing recently and where we are. The members of MRC include operators, owners, developers, technology providers, business partners, people that provide legal and consulting services. And as of May 15th, they include Bloom Energy, Concord Engineering, Eaton, Econ Law, Emory University, NG, Fager Drinker, ICE Tech, IDEA, Mainspring, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Princeton University, Reimagine Power, Resilience Plus recently joined us, Schneider Electric, we're so pleased to have them, Scale Microgrids, Thermo Systems, the University of Missouri, Columbia, and one of the largest microgrids, I think, really in the US, University of Texas, Austin. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. Ali Detrio is Chief Strategist with Reimagine Power. She's really been kind of the MRC boots on the ground in California. She's focused on microgrids and sustainability policy really across the West Coast. Her clients include developers, clean tech startups, and nonprofits, mostly organizations focused on a more sustainable world. Prior to Reimagine Power, Ali was manager of policy and strategy at NG. NG is one of the world's largest independent power producers. Ali's been really, I think, has a huge passion for the sector and was recognized by the California Solar and Storage Association. They gave her the MVP award in 2018 for the work she did in commercializing microgrids with California legislation SB 1339, which is really the framework we'll hear much about today, and then legislation for energy storage incentives. I know Ali is a proud graduate of Arizona State University in the first class of the Global Initiative of Sustainability. So that, please introduce Ali. I'm going to introduce our full panel, and then I'll hand it over to Ali. Also on today, Christopher Beren. Chris is a partner at Fager Drinker. He's based in Washington, D.C. He's counsel to the Microgrid Resources Coalition and brings 20 years of experience in the power sector, both regulatory and transaction. He's an energy partner in the environmental and energy practice at Fager Drinker and focuses on design and operations of energy and environmental markets. He's really just a wellspring of experience and insight. Chris received his Bachelor of Arts from Kenyon College, was in an executive leadership program at University of Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business, and his JD from Vermont Law School, one of the, I think, more esteemed environmental law schools in our country. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce, welcome Chris, I'm pleased to introduce Baird Brown, who's a principal with Econ Law. Baird is based in Philadelphia. He's counsel also to the Microgrid Resources Coalition and really brings just a extensive background in public-private partnerships, privatization of public services. He's the principal and founder of Econ Law, and he works really with energy customers, communities, their technology partners in deploying new energy generation and sustainability infrastructure. Baird has his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from SUNY Buffalo and his JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Baird, I should acknowledge, is also a significant Philadelphia Eagles fan, but we don't let that come between us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ali. And Ali, maybe if you could unmute, I'll go to mute and take it away.
All right, great. Thanks everybody for joining. Really excited to have you all here with us today. So as Rob mentioned, we're gonna go through and talk about a lot of the work that we've been doing in California thus far, both on the legislative side and the regulatory. So I'm gonna start today by just kind of setting the stage for what's happening in the Capitol and especially what's happened in the 3 months since the pandemic really took hold in California. So originally the governor's budget proposed in early January this year had a really strong and aggressive climate and resiliency agenda. We had over $12 billion allocated to climate change mitigation efforts across multiple different funding sources. So I'm going to go through a little bit of those in detail here. So originally in January, we had a number of different elements of our climate budget. We have the cap and trade expenditure plan, which was allocating $965 million for the year. The governor created a climate catalyst fund, which would have had $250 million in it. There would have been significant general fund and one-time investments in ongoing expenditures, as well as the sponsoring of a climate resilience bond, which when introduced was approximately $4.75 billion, which would have been which would be put on the ballot in November, assuming that the legislation passed. So really significant climate budget, and we're really excited to see that much of that is still in the governor's May revised budget that was released last week. But since January, we've had quite a number of changes to our budget and just the state of affairs in California. Much of California's revenue comes from capital gain taxes and sales tax, and with the pandemic shutting down the state very significantly, a lot of revenues we thought we were going to have just may not materialize. And so with the governor's May revise, he really projected a very bare bones budget. And so when they first started estimating what the impacts of the budget deficit would be, the estimates ranged anywhere from $20 billion to $54 billion. So estimates varying wildly, and this doesn't just extend to climate and resiliency, this is across the board. And so with the May revise, we have a pretty bare budget just to make sure that all existing programs can continue, and the governor had to opt not to expand some of the new programs. So some of the things that are not going forward in the budget this year is the Climate Catalyst Fund, which again would have been a new program that at this time we're not going to be able to continue for the 2020-2021 budget cycle. We look forward to working with the administration in future years to make sure that becomes a part of California's climate policy strategy in the future. The other thing that was difficult was that the climate resiliency bond is no longer being sponsored by the governor. Now, the climate resiliency bond right now is in several vehicles in legislation. The one that seems to be moving right now is AB 3256, which I'll get to in a moment. And so while the governor himself and his administration is not sponsoring officially a climate resilience bond, there still is a legislative vehicle moving for that at this time, which we're really excited about, and MRC is looking forward to supporting, hopefully through the end of this year. So while this, and the last thing with cap and trade funds is that instead of it being allocated all up front, the funding is going to be allocated on a pay as you go, where after every quarterly auction, we will evaluate the revenues that were brought in from cap and trade funds, and then they will be dispersed. So the current cap and trade expenditure plan keeps the $965 million in the budget right now, but it remains to be seen how much actual revenues we will get from the cap and trade funds. So that's still to come. Anyway, and then finally, the budget needs to be passed by June 15th per California Constitution. We are confident that there will be a revised budget issued after that may expand on some of these things, but all of that's really unclear right now, and I think we really have to see what happens over the next several months with us, with the state of California managing the impacts of the pandemic, both economically and in public health and safety. So it's possible this could be the budget for the year. It's very possible that there also could be another budget issued later in 2020. Next slide, please. So keeping in line with the pandemic impacting state government, a lot of bills that were introduced earlier in this year that were really strong when it comes to promoting different climate and resiliency strategies had to be reduced or cut completely. One of the big ones that I want to call out here was SB 1314 by Senator Dodd, the Community Energy Resilience Act of 2020. This would have created a framework for local local governments to really take control of their energy and resiliency planning needs, and create a statewide framework for all these local governments to take advantage of funding and resources for climate resiliency at all levels. So we're really excited to work on that bill, and disappointed that it had to be pulled back this year, but we're looking forward to continuing working with Senator Dodd's office on that in the future. Another really great one that we were excited to support was AB 3021 by Assemblymember Ting with Resilient Schools. The Microgrid Resources Coalition feels that schools, really serve as that, center community resilience hub. And, we were excited to see Assemblymember Ting sponsor this bill, and really looking forward to working with that office on how we can make sure that schools are made more resilient, whether that's through the budget process in the future, a new bill, or incorporating schools into some other resiliency strategy in the future. And just a shout out to all the other senators and assembly members on this list who are all carrying really amazing bills, looking to mitigate the impacts of climate change, make our communities more resilient, really accelerate clean energy deployment in California. So there's a lot of leadership on this slide here, and we're looking forward to continuing this work in 2021 with the various legislators on this list and many others that I did not include on here because I only had so much room on the slide. Next slide, please. So luckily for us, we do still have some bills moving. I'm going to touch on a few of these and go into detail on one. So Senator Stern, who has been a great champion for climate and resiliency legislation, has two bills that are currently still moving right now. He has SB 1258, which is the California Climate Technology and Infrastructure Financing Act that was just passed out of committee earlier this week, really looking to help expand the iBank's capabilities to financing clean energy and resiliency projects. And his bill, SB 1215 with microgrids, is currently in Senate Energy Committee with a hearing set for Tuesday. The MRC's been working with Senator Stern on this legislation. We're really excited to continue pushing microgrid policy forward in California. Right now, this bill definitely subject to change over time as we're continuing to get feedback from different stakeholders. But right now, the bill originally was created to create a new program, the Local Government De-Energization Event Resiliency Program, which would have allocated funding and resources to local governments to help them develop microgrids and other resilient energy solutions to mitigate the impacts of PSPS. This was developed back in January and February before the pandemic really hit, and we thought, we would have an opportunity at securing new funding from the state. Now that that's no longer the case, we have amended the bill where it's still going to focus on critical facilities and really looking to make them more resilient. The other things that the bill does right now is assign a resource adequacy value for microgrids, which would really help drive the pathway forward for the monetization of microgrids. And the final thing the bill currently does is allows for microgrids to cross intervening streets if one of the components got either SGIP or EPIC funding, and serve as kind of that core element of a microgrid, and then would be able to move forward from there and really enable the first level of multi-customer microgrids on a limited basis. So we're really excited to see where the bill goes from here. It's scheduled for a hearing on the 26th, and assuming it gets out of committee, we'll be continuing to work with the author to push it through the legislature this year. So that's the big legislation on microgrids in 2020 this year. Really excited that Senator Stern has continued his championing of microgrids. A couple of the others I'll just note really briefly. We have the Green New Deal, which is still moving. It passed out of committee last week on the 14th. We have another bill, AB 3163, Assemblymember Salas, which is expanding the definition of biogas, something that we think will really help with microgrids in general as they proliferate across California, because we do think that there needs to be a flexible fuel backbone for many microgrids. And so having biogas as a renewable source of fuel really will help with the development of long duration resilient microgrids. And finally, SB 350 by Senator Hill, the Golden State Energy Act. that bill is making sure that in the event that PG&E did not emerge from bankruptcy, that there would be a pathway for the state to take over the utility. And so the hearing for that one is currently set for the 28th, although we are, assuming that PG&E will emerge from bankruptcy and move forward in its current state. The final one that I'll come back to that I mentioned before is AB 3256 with Assemblymember Garcia. This is the Wildfire Prevention, Safe Drinking Water, Climate Resilience, Drought Preparation, and Flood Protection Bond Act of 2020. Whew. It's been expanded since it was originally proposed in the governor's budget. It currently authorizes $6.8 billion in climate and resiliency bond funding. There's a lot of different things that have been expanded within the bond, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but we're really excited that the bond has been increased in size, and that the authors of this legislation are very supportive of continuing to move it forward this year. So it passed out of the Assembly Natural Resources Committee on the 13th, and now is in Appropriations Committee hearing yet to be set. So a lot of things that are still happening, which we're really excited about, and really happy to see that despite having some issues, with legislation and moving things forward because of the pandemic, that California government is being resilient in continuing to move forward climate legislation. Next slide, please. And so what's going on with microgrids right now besides that legislation? Just a really brief history lesson for everyone. SB 1339 was the vehicle for microgrid legislation in 2018, also authored by Senator Stern. So SB 1339 directs the CPUC to create a standardized interconnection process for microgrids and separate rates and tariffs as necessary to facilitate the commercialization of microgrids by 2020. That was passed and signed into law in September of 2018, and a year later, the CPUC opened a rulemaking to implement SB 1339. So over the last 7-8 months, we've been working on this proceeding, and we'll go into a lot more detail about it in a minute, but I just want to give an overview of the timeline here. So the proceeding opened in September, and the scoping ruling was issued at the end of December last year. So in the very beginning of this year, the IOUs and the Energy Division staff issued proposals in January of 2020 on short-term resiliency strategies for microgrids in advance of the 2020 wildfire season. This was done because we had the campfire happen in 2018 after the bill was passed, and then in 2019 we started having a lot of issues with public safety power shutoffs in all 3 utility territories, but specifically PG&E. And so the scoping ruling amended the implementation to include resiliency strategies, not just facilitate the commercialization of microgrids. And so which is very important as we've seen how this proceeding has evolved thus far. SB 1339 was passed, and really the spirit of the legislation was to create a market for microgrids, specifically for customer microgrids, and to really facilitate the broader deployment of them statewide. This was developed because we saw with the California Energy Commission grants with microgrids how successful they were and how promising it was as resilient energy technologies that could help their customers better manage their own energy use. And so that's what the bill was all about, was getting microgrids to be a commercial product that would be able to be deployed statewide by customers. After the bill was passed, we had the campfire, very devastating, and then in 2019 we had a series of PSPS events that caused the PUC to want to expand the scope of the implementation of SB 1339 to more specifically address some of those resiliency issues that came up in 2019. And so here we are in 2020, where we just received a proposed decision on track 1 in April 29th. And right now the commission can vote on it its earliest June 11th business meeting. So we anticipate that we will get a vote either in June 11th or soon after that. We're really looking to have these strategies in place before the 2020 fire season. And so that's kind of where we're at right now with track 1. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Baird to go into more detail about it.
Thanks, Emily. Emily, please move us to the next slides, and thanks, Allie. Appreciate that overview. Before our team talks the details of the track 1 microgrid docket, in front of the California Public Utilities Commission and highlights what we think is necessary and in accordance with the direction with SB 1339 for the Track 2 docket. Wanted to hit on some high-level issues. First and foremost, in these COVID and wildfire times that California is experiencing, essential community services and making sure that they are maintained and available to our communities is critical. Hospitals, schools, first responders, grocery stores, pharmacies, gas stations. These are critical elements that our members of our communities rely on to make it through difficult times, including the ones that we're seeing now. Microgrids can provide the resiliency, the long duration resiliency that they need. Microgrids are not just there as a backup in difficult times when the skies are blue and the grid is operating normally. Microgrids can provide a host of dynamic services, support a range of goals, resiliency goals, economic goals, environmental goals, grid modernization goals, climate goals in particular, and are able to provide a lot of services, not just to their hosts, not just to the folks included within the microgrid, but out to the utilities, the grid itself, and ultimately the communities. They offer cost savings, clean energy to their customers, but that's, again, not just the host customers for the microgrid, but customers throughout, because the advantage of the dynamic service provision at low cost that they're able to provide. When we do have emergency conditions, whether it's for PSPS shutoffs because of wildfire conditions, whether it's for a range of emergencies, microgrids are able to balance themselves and provide, and this is really the key, long duration, robust islands. They're able to sustain themselves and with them often many critical facilities providing essential services to communities for days on end, not just hours on end. And this is a key attribute, for microgrids. Finally, microgrids, when they offer services to utilities to the benefit of those utilities conducting the dispatchable DER concert, they can provide benefits to all ratepayers. And so when you focus on the provision of microgrid services by microgrids to utilities, to wholesale markets and so on, but in particularly to utilities that are trying to balance an ever more complex concert at the distribution level of distributed energy resources, you can, through those services, have the benefits of microgrids realized by ratepayers without asking the ratepayers to bear the cost of constructing the microgrids themselves. Next slide. Now, California, in commercializing microgrids, which is, as Ali underscored, is the spirit of SB 1339. There's a lot of challenges facing, and these are challenges that the MRC has been active on the microgrid docket in front of the legislature and in a number of other venues trying to address. There's financial barriers. In particular, departing load charges and standby charges are onerous, and their current formulation is outdated. And we'll get to that in a more detail later on in this presentation. There's regulatory barriers such as the over-the-fence rules and the risk of tripping utility status, which for those of us who do microgrid project development and finance know that utility status can kill projects, just the risk of it. And so clarity on how you do and don't trip utility status formulating those buckets are important to getting microgrids deployed, especially microgrids that can serve a variety of applications and customers. Interconnection. Currently, we got complex processes, lengthy timelines. Now, there are some exceptions. As Baird will talk about, there's folks who are doing a good job at it. But overall, for microgrids, there's still a long road ahead of us till we get to efficient interconnection standards. Right now, as in many jurisdictions, California is proceeding down interconnection, often on a resource type by resource type approach. Microgrids unify a number of generation, storage, and dynamic load resources within one controllable package. And so a unified approach for microgrids on interconnection that includes all of the resources that they can bring to bear, we think is important, because that informs how microgrids are able to present to the grid, not just as what they require from the grid, but what they can offer to the grid in terms of services. Now, when we talk about offering the grid, I mean, that's really market participation. And right now, there's not really an easy pathway set up for microgrids in California to serve their hosts, but also access the regional wholesale market and provide services to utilities. Other jurisdictions around the country in other ISOs and RTOs are a little bit farther down the line than California is on this front. And California has some opportunities to catch up. Overall, the message here is that the Commission needs to encourage multiple use applications for microgrids. They can do so much. They are unprecedented in their flexibility as resources in the grid system. And that flexibility allows them to perform and offer products and services at quite economic, and competitive rates. So all this leads to our desire, as the Commission looks to wrap up track 1 in the microgrid docket and looks ahead to track 2, to look to develop tariffs specific to enabling the growth and the commercialization of customer microgrids and customer microgrid services. This is a key aspect that we need to keep the focus on. And as we look forward to getting to addressing the emergency conditions that California is facing, but also laying the groundwork for the future that's in accordance with all the goals that the legislature has been very clear that it wants to set out when it comes to grid modernization and environmental protection. We think the Commission really needs to keep its eye on the prize as to what SB 1339 is directing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-counsel, Baird Brown, to talk a bit about the CPUC's implementation of SB 1339 in track 1 to date.
Thanks, Chris. There we go. So in December, as Ali pointed out, we had a scoping ruling that when the Public Utility Commission started out and opened up the proceeding, it said, tell us what the scope should be. And everybody submitted 2 rounds of comments on what the scope should be. And they issued a ruling in December saying, here's what we think. And they did something that we and a lot of others asked them to do, which is create a track 1 to try and do some urgent things that would possibly allow new facilities to be built and in practice before the fire season in 2020. And they said to both their energy staff and the utilities to go ahead and develop proposals. And they kind of expanded the focus, understandably, in the context of the fires and the PSPS events, that to focus on resiliency as well as the broader notion of commercializing microgrids. Everybody and his brother was interested in this, and we've had over 50 parties intervene so far. Next slide. So proposals were submitted in early January, and the scoping ruling basically set a forced march of an early schedule. They gave basically 5 weeks to the 4 big players here to send in their first proposals, and then gave 1 week for comments and 1 week for reply comments. So the Energy Division focused on 3 sets of things: interconnection, streamlining, and prioritizing, and building staffing their proposals, which I think really are aimed at all microgrids, unlike most of what else happened in track 1. Modifying storage and sizing challenges for small microgrids, and providing, and this is, I think, another one that was important and goes to a wide variety of microgrids, but focused on initiatives by communities and local governments to bring more resiliency to their communities and to have the backup from the utility in terms of data and communications that would allow them to play a role in planning for their communities. So then the PG&E jumped in with a large proposal for permanent generation, gas-fired generation, and a program to prepare their substations to have temporary or permanent generation that would help obviate the dependence on transmission lines that may run through fire-sensitive territories, and a program, community microgrid enablement program, to try and help communities move forward with microgrids. And SC&E said a variety of things, but one thing they did was sort of initiate or really report on a program to have microgrids behind the meter at several schools, and get proposals for that from folks in the industry. And SDG&E sort of reported that, hey guys, we got this interconnection thing down to a science for the at least for the small solar and storage already. We're already doing most applications in under 30 days. Can we stick with doing what we're doing instead of doing something else new? And they also proposed, they're thinking ahead to grid sectionalization, which we'll come back to, and sort of taking advantage of multiple DERs on the grid by having a local area distribution controller. The only thing that alarmed a few people anyway was that their contract proposed to buy that software from an affiliate. Next slide. So as I said, there were 2 rounds. Everybody commented, and then on 4 proposals, and then everybody commented on 50 people's comments. And somehow by April, the ALJ and the staff had sorted all that out and issued a ruling, a preliminary proposed decision, and it gave us all about 4 weeks to comment on that before they submit it to go final to the commission. And basically, they within the proposals from the staff, they accepted a great many of the proposals. They took on a lot of the interconnection things, increasing resources, building standard templates to help small microgrids connect easily, and creating additional staff to work through the applications and to assist communities as they went along. They modified the net energy metering, that's what NEM stands for, tariffs for resilience, which is all good, although it's like those are all 30 kilowatts or smaller. They're 0.3 of a megawatt. So it's all good, but it's not really addressing the big microgrids. And they did a lot of stuff on the local government relations front, building a new portal for grid infrastructure data and things to help planning, and creating a resiliency project guide so that local governments can understand how to work their way through the process. And one of the things we were really pleased about was that the utilities have to conduct a semi-annual resilience planning meeting at the county level with the moderator being hopefully the local Office of Emergency Services, who are the folks who have been thinking about what it takes to be resilient and respond to emergencies for a long time. So we were pleased with that. Next slide. The utilities came back and a lot. Well, some water went over the dam in the meantime before the proposals. PG&E's permanent generation proposal was withdrawn, and then they 3 days after they emerged from bankruptcy, they submitted a massive new proposal, which we suggested to the commission probably wasn't a good idea to delay track one to start a whole new thing analysis of. And the commission agreed, or the ALJ did. They put in, they approved temporary generation, but only for 2020, this fire season, and that's sort of a work in progress. And they approved the sort of a pilot, if you will, of the microgrid enablement program, which I think is something we all think could be a good thing, depending how it actually gets implemented. The SC&E proposal was also withdrawn. They acknowledged in a filing with the commission that it had been kind of hastily prepared, and they hadn't given people enough time to respond well, and they said what we got were expensive proposals that were at least 13 times what it would have cost to build it ourselves, and that splashed all over the industry press. I just want to point out that members of the Microgrid Resources Coalition have been operating commercially effective microgrids, some of them for over 30 years. If you got expensive proposals, it may have been, well, that you asked too quickly, as they acknowledged, or that you really didn't know what you were meant to be asking for, which is another possible problem. And in any event, things were approved for San Diego Gas and Electric to move forward with the local distribution controller, but it's subject to review on the affiliate transaction standards. Next slide. So the big takeaways. This is slide 18, right? Am I handing this off to you, Allie?
Oh, go ahead and finish your sentence, though.
No, that's okay. Take it away.
So yeah, thanks, Baird. That was a really good overview. And so, folks, I think at the end of the day, one of our biggest takeaways is that progress is being made here. The local governments and the CCAs were definitely the main beneficiaries of track one, with really, having a lot more, commission facilitated communications, the creation of a new data portal that will help them with their resiliency and microgrid planning, project development support. Those are the big things that really helped the local governments and community choice aggregators as they look to deploy these projects. Other big win was for the solar and storage industry, changing a lot of the net metering tariffs to allow for storage to be sized to appropriately meet the resiliency needs of customers is really big, as well as beefed up interconnection resources. Really being able to speed up the processing time for interconnection is going to help all projects with all types of distributed energy resources. So that was something we were really glad to see, that interconnection resources are going to be significantly strengthened over the next 6 months. And really for what I believe is that the CPUC, in adopting a lot of these decisions with track one, focused on the lowest hanging fruit in order to get solutions in place before the 2020 fire season. So, having small solar and storage get fixed when it comes to interconnection and sizing restrictions removed really is going to help those customers that are medically vulnerable, since most of those customers are residential customers or very small commercial that would have that would install solar and batteries to ensure that they can have resiliency for 12 to 24 hours in an outage. As well as, I think the commission really identified, based on a lot of feedback from various stakeholders, that the communication practices and relations between the utilities and the local governments really needed immediate attention and substantial improvement. And so that's why in this track one decision, we really saw a lot of focus on utility government relations and solar and storage fixes that were needed beforehand, and the microgrid proceeding ended up being the venue to make those changes. And so that's where the progress has been made to date for track one. Next slide.
So now I think it's back to me. Yeah, there were a lot of wins in a sort of a narrowly focused proceeding, but there were, from our point of view, a bunch of reservations. The interconnection streamlining is great stuff. We think the standardized template process should be available for all technologies, and we basically, this slide summarizes what we had to say in our comments on the draft order. That we have members in the Microgrid Resources Coalition who are basically prepared to install the equivalent of a microgrid in a box. They have sort of standard designs. They could come in with templates that the interconnection authorities could use to speed things up, and we're hoping that they'll give them a chance to do that. We think that it shouldn't just be the small facilities that should be prioritized. It ought to be, or just community applications. It ought to be all applications for critical facilities, and we'll come back to that thought in a bit. Community empowerment is great, but there were a lot of things going on in the order about the, in terms of the advisory capacities of the utilities, that suggested that they might be sort of giving the communities approved lists of kinds of projects, or getting involved in design decisions behind the meter, and we thought that was a bad idea and asked that that be clarified. And we noted, as we had pointed out in earlier filings, that once a community figures out what it needs to be resilient in an emergency, oftentimes that involves facilities that are actually owned by private parties. I mean, not just the hospitals, who might be for-profit or non-profit, but everything from the grocery store to the gas station, and so great to have the lights on at the public school as an emergency shelter, but want to be able to keep the lights on at those businesses and service organizations that are also necessary, so that as they're making information available, it needs to be made available to those critical facility owners and operators, and also to their consultants and contractors and so forth, to really make this work and to build the industry that 1339 thought we were going to do. And finally, we're concerned that sectionalization is a great idea. In the long run, we see a future for utilities. Chris used the phrase conducting the DER concert. There's going to be a whole lot more distributed energy resources. A lot of them are going to be parts of microgrids that keep things safe in emergencies. But during the blue sky situations, the grid is still going to be run by the grid operator, and those services and the ability of the microgrid operator to take advantage of them through the controllers and the ability to section off one substation or a feeder or whatever is good stuff. But if you build the architecture of that in ways that mean that the DERs really can't use it and it's only for plugging in utility temporary generation, you kind of miss the point and are investing in things that are going to be a long run loss. And so we suggested that they should put that in as a criteria for evaluation. And finally, there was a suggestion by PG&E that they do a community microgrid tariff, and we, as much as we want tariffs, we don't think the way that should be done is sort of, okay, one for communities, one for customers, one for the little guys, one for the big guys. We really need to get a statewide scope for a pro forma tariff, and in a public process that is supervised by the commission. Next slide. So that was track one. We'll all wait with bated breath for when we see an order. There may be some reply comments in the next week. But the next step is track two, and here we are continuing to focus and spend some time in our track one comments, reminding them that track two is where the real focus of the original bill was. We need to commercialize customer microgrids, and we need to prioritize interconnection improvements for everybody, and we need to include all kinds of CARB approved distributed energy resources, and in thinking about microgrids, we need to focus on that single controllable entity that the bill actually calls out. We need to be able to not say, oh, but the battery might not work right. You got to say, wait a minute, there's two different kinds of generation besides the battery, and all this demand response and sophisticated controls, and whatever happens within that microgrid, they're pretty able to deal with it. And the standards need to focus on that end of it and not on individual pieces of equipment or technologies, because we can't live by solar and storage alone. Next. So we've already said multiple times that the tariffs have to be prioritized. This is a list of things we think goes into a tariff, and there's all the financial barriers that have already been mentioned and that Chris is going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. So I'll turn it over, I think, to Chris on the next slide.
Thanks, Baird. One thing we wanted to hit on is the concept of equitable resiliency. The reality is that there are many folks in California that can't afford and/or are not allowed to, because say maybe they're renters and so on, to install and put up solar plus storage or a backup generation system the way that other folks might have an option to do so. Microgrids at critical community facilities are often the only service support refuge available to folks in communities that might get hit by a combination of a grid outage because of a wildfire, and again, we're also facing challenges from the virus, as we're seeing right now. For low-income ratepayers, the neighborhood microgrid at the community center, at the hospital, at the grocery store, at the pharmacy might be the only way that they can get the essential services that they need during times of duress, and especially when those times of duress might be longer in duration, with the grid potentially being out a number of days, as we've seen has happened, and so on. Therefore, when we look at departing load charges, which in many ways are backward looking, and modernizing standby charges. It is really first and foremost in support of being able to enable community resilience and enabling dynamic microgrid services. Because again, microgrids are able to be called in concert by a local utility during a situation where finer management of the distribution grid can breed a lot of benefits. The values in that community resilience, especially for equitable resilience to low-income communities, and the value of those microgrid services when they get accurately assessed, in many ways really mitigates some of the historical stranded cost and ratepayer cost shifting issues that underlie much of the departing load charge and standby charge dynamics that we see currently. Really making it more difficult for ratepayers to directly benefit from resilient essential community services, making it more difficult to know that I can get medical care, that I can get food, that I can get my medicine, that I can be able to go and charge my phone and take a shower somewhere or cool down. When you look at that value stack, and when you look at the value stack on microgrid services locally provided and locally able to efficiently address imbalances and constraints in the grid system at the distribution level, we really believe that that really greatly outweighs ratepayer cost shifting benefits. And to say that we're going to assess microgrids, fairly significant charges, and do so to the detriment of ratepayers benefiting from resilient essential community services in the name of protecting those same ratepayers from a cost shift that is complex, and as we'll talk about in a second, in many ways not accurately assessed, but we really think that that's not the greatest scoring of value. And to this, it's really time to get real here. Not an issue. This is an issue that we're seeing not just in California, but around the entire country. It's an issue we see commonly in integrative resource planning. Microgrids are not simply demand destruction, not simply negative load. They are dynamic, flexible resources that can provide a host of competitive services to the grid at a number of levels. The resource diversity, the internal load shedding, really makes their operations much more flexible than the simple operational models that we're seeing used to assess departing load and standby charges. The issue here is going forward, the grid's not a fixed asset that ratepayers are paying for like a mortgage. It's a dynamic provider of services that needs to, shift and modernize with the times. And, it appears that stakeholders across the board really agree with that and are moving forward. State and local governments had these forward-looking goals, climate goals, grid modernization goals in particular, that require a lot of new investment. And customers and communities are prepared to make that investment. If we can remove, and it's not updated, excuse me, that should be outdated, burdens and barriers, and we can stimulate private capital to finance microgrid construction, still let the ratepayers benefit from the procurement of services from microgrids without having to pay for their CapEx, we can create that future where we have more microgrids in the grid system that can act as dynamic shock absorbers that allow for much higher penetrations of distributed energy resources, renewable energy, and the like. And, in conclusion, before we put to the Q&A, I'll highlight that, this approach in asking utilities to focus on what services they can procure for microgrids to deliver on the smart grid promise to ratepayers and communities, that's something where we see a huge future for utilities in conducting that DER concert. We need utilities, all of us need utilities to make significant investments in control technology. While doing that, customers and communities, the microgrid industry is ready to funnel investment, undertake development, to put in place those dynamic dispatchable resources that are microgrids and put them in place such that everyone in various stakeholder groups can take advantage of their benefits. Right now, overall, we're seeing a regulatory approach in California, but in many jurisdictions around the country, that are treating microgrids in an antiquated fashion. I'll leave you with an analogy. Today's advanced microgrids are like a smartphone, but we're still being treated by regulators like we're an old rotary phone, with many use and application opportunities and capabilities remaining unaddressed. And fundamentally, that's the reason why the Microgrid Resources Coalition exists, is to provide fair recognition and compensation for the services that microgrids are able to offer, not only to their hosts, but to the broader grid, their communities, and so on. And with that, I'll turn it back to Rob, who can lead us through question and answers.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks all. So we've received a number of questions. I'm going to try to zip through them and maybe be a little selective. First question to all panelists. Do you see resiliency as being the main driver for microgrids in California? Is resiliency really the primary factor? And you should all go live. That's fine. Allie?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And thanks for the question, folks. And please feel free to keep asking them. We can go a little over one. I think that resiliency is definitely the main driver of microgrids in California. I think between the public safety power shutoffs and now that we have, issues with the coronavirus and making sure that, before the next wildfire season, we can make, folks more resilient and onward afterwards, that it's definitely going to be one of the biggest drivers. But I do also think that we are moving into a world where we have a more transactive distributed energy future, where customers do want to take control over their own energy costs, and things like the Nest thermostat and installing solar or a fuel cell. People want to take more control over their energy costs. I think just becoming more engaged, but I think in general the resiliency value proposition is really what's driving microgrids in California right now.
Yeah, and so maybe even referencing, this notion of, relates to departing load charges, and Chris, the analogy of smartphone, rotary phone, and, it's pretty clear, particularly in California, that the utility paradigm has really been sort of flipped upside down, right? So last year we had public service power, cutoffs, and really the grid that we've all taken for granted really wasn't there. I mean, it literally was shut off, and so now we actually have these technologies that can support end users more effectively. So how do if it is resilience, how do we primarily supply that resilience? Well, there was a question about natural gas, diesel, fuel. Baird, and the quandary of solar and storage versus maybe longer duration microgrid assets. How do we support those longer duration assets with liquid fuels?
Well, for now, yes, and in the future, probably yes, but maybe very different liquid fuels. The world is evolving. Hydrogen is coming. I've been talking to a group recently that's working on a partially hydrogenated hydrogen fuel that carbohydrate that regenerates, and they can just recycle it through the fuel cell and then recharge it again. So many people are working on many alternatives to natural gas right now. Right now, diesel is evil. I mean, in terms of emissions, and it's really any place you can not use diesel is a good place to not use diesel. And natural gas, on the other hand, when it's used in cogeneration, that is to say, when you have like a hospital that can take that has a huge thermal load, they have to have steam for the sterilizing machines, and they have to keep the operating rooms at 55. All that stuff can be done with the steam part of the fuel use, and that comes out to being about 80–85% efficient compared to grid use of natural gas, which is about 40% efficient, and grid use of other things, which is even worse. So if you're going to use natural gas, the place to use it is, you know, locally, to make these, you know, localities and facilities like hospitals resilient. And somebody in the questions pointed out that, well, parts of the state, there really isn't, you know, piped in natural gas, and that's right. And there may be, on the one hand, I know there's a lot of efforts afoot from the biomass folks to take advantage of all the waste fuel that's lying on the floors of the forests and being a problem, and turn it into a solution, and you know, have, you know, wood-fired or other bio-fired generation. And in where that's not going to work well in the densely populated areas where there are gas, it may work in some of the other areas. So there's going to be a lot of motion forward on that, and a lot of people are working on it. But you basically have to have fuel that you can store on site, that you can use to run, or that you can rely on being piped in, that you can rely on to run for a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
actually, just
building
on
Ellie.
that really quick, you know, I do think that, you know, you hit on the point of biomass, Baird, and I think that's something that, you know, doesn't really get a lot of love in California, because people, you know, equate that to not being clean, so to speak. But, you know, biomass in a lot of those rural parts of Northern California, for example, you know, we have very high tree mortality rates in California. You know, we have a major bark beetle infestation problem. We have a lot of dead trees in certain areas, and that's really what's causing a lot of the wildfires that are not being caused by the utilities. So we have a ton of fuel and other bioenergy resources that we could put to good use. And, you know, bioenergy fueled microgrids really could be a huge solution in those rural areas, because it's not just about supplying energy, but not just that you have the fuel for the forest, but it's part of the wildfire mitigation efforts that, you know, the state has said we are undertaking. You know, there's a lot of fuel reduction and forest health initiatives that have to be continue on in California. And so bioenergy, and especially bioenergy fueled microgrids, really could be an innovative solution in the rural northern parts of the state. So, you know, I think we do have a few folks working on that, and to the extent that we can continue pushing that forward, absolutely. And, you know, I see on the Q&A that someone asked about the biogas legislation that I mentioned earlier. And what the bill would do is expand the definition of biogas to include any organic waste that can be gasified and injected into the pipeline. So essentially cleaning up our gas system using organic waste that can be gasified. So something like forest biomass, for example, instead of open pile burning it in the forest, which spews a lot more pollution into the air than if you were to use it for bioenergy, you could use that fuel and put it into the gas system and actually start generating more renewable fuels and cleaning up the gas system for the future. So there's a lot of opportunity we see with biogas in the future, even though, you know, right now it's still nascent market and we're still, you know, getting it off the ground here in California.
Yeah. Rob, one short follow on. It's not either or. I mean, the real important thing to remember here is that microgrids can, you know, take certainly solar, certainly storage, you know, maybe even wind in the right locations. And what it takes is not 100% fossil fuel to run them. What it takes is, say, 30%, the research that I've seen, you know, maybe the right balance. It may be a little higher for a hospital that needed a lot for thermal load anyway, but for most places and things, you know, you're talking about filling in the gaps for the renewables. You're not talking and making the renewables possible. And so compared to the current situation where we're California is sort of on the path to its goals for 2045. You know, this will move the average for renewables on the system forward if you implement it in multi-generation microgrids.
Yeah, and so the ability to integrate, you know, multiple inputs really for multiple outputs, right? I mean, that's sort of the beauty of a microgrid in its way. And just for the audience, I mean, UCLA has been operating, you know, their CHP plant off gas from the landfill for literally 25 years. That's been the primary fuel. And just north of California in British Columbia, University of British Columbia is a gasifying, waste streams, which is, kind of beetle-driven, knockdown forest. And there are technologies that have been proven and used and competitive economically and long life. It really does become sort of, I think, a localized solution. I'd like to get to another question. This goes to the departing load and standby charges. And one of the questions were sort of thinking that these are rarely applied in practice. And we do at the MRC, we do have a document that outlines, kind of how these charges are applied and who pays them. I'm going to open it up to others, but one of the challenges with departing load charges and standby is that they can be whimsical and impose risk on projects. And the one thing that investors don't like is increased risk. And that's really where we want the Public Utility Commission to kind of weigh in, is that historically maybe they haven't been applied, but they have, and they have actually impaired project financing very late in the game, more often than we'd like to all recognize. And we have submitted comments on that. If they're on our website, microgridresources.com. And so I think, as an industry, we see DLCs and standby charges as like the sword of Damocles, right? It's, it hangs over these projects, and the risk mitigation, that's an area where we need engagement and support. Chris, maybe over to you on that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of developers have been used to, the surprise out of the interconnection study as an unexpected, cost multiplier on a project. DLCs and SBCs can have that same effect. What makes them particularly complex for microgrids is that because microgrids, as Baird was laying out, often contain multiple different sources of generation, storage, dynamic controls on load, and the ability to control them all in concert as a single entity to present any number of different ways to the grid. The way that departing load and standby charges sometimes get assessed on the basis of specific technologies, some might be exempt, others might not be exempt, and so on, can be complex. But overall, the problem that we see is that it's a very simplistic view as to how those charges are assessed. And it kind of ignores the ability of microgrids to deploy the concert of resources within them as a unified single controllable entity to make it such that the likelihood that the full load of the microgrid would, say, flash onto the grid at any one time and require massive imports from the utility is significantly lessened. Again, microgrids have the ability to load shed, to generate across a number of different, resources, to store energy. We highlight to folks that, while you often, folks often think about their abilities of their hosts, that ability to act as a shock absorber on the system, as Baird and I were joking the other day, to absorb the duck when they need to in California. In the duck curve. Microgrids, if advantageous, can ramp their imports the same way they can absolutely ramp down and almost zero out their imports. And go the other direction and export out over their bus to the grid as needed. That flexibility that has been demonstrated time and time again in real world operations and capabilities still hasn't been recognized on the regulatory front. As some of our attendees have asked in Q&A, we don't see technical issues. We don't see problems with availability of private capital looking to finance. The barriers here are really often regulatory. And when those barriers manifest in the form of what can be significant charges, project killing charges, And those charges are based off operational assumptions that are overly simplistic. Again, operational assumptions that we see all the time that treat an advanced microgrid smartphone like it's an old, copper-based digital, a rotary phone. Those are the type of things that are just not helpful in terms of construct, and that we need to address.
So,
yeah, like one thing I'll just add to that is that, it's one thing to have, a 1 to 3 megawatt microgrid versus, a CCA taking, 3,000 megawatts away from an IOU as departing load, but yet departing load charges really treat those two situations as equal. And there's a massive difference between, a 1 megawatt microgrid, 1 to 3 megawatts versus, a CCA with load migration, yet they're treated the same. And so, the MRC believes that microgrids deserve, should have, the impact on the grid looked at in the manner that's, appropriate to the scale.
Yes. And
so
remember,
let's talk about scale for a moment. So one of the questions, does the group see any recognition of microgrids at a city block scale rather than just a critical facility? I think we all do, but anyone care, Bear, would you care to, so scaling these up?
Sure. Hi, Terry. I saw your question. The city block scale microgrids are absolutely possible, but the barriers in California that we've alluded to may make them extraordinarily difficult. The city of Berkeley tried to do that, and sort of after a while they gave up. There are, and it's expensive to string new wires, which is what you essentially would have to do, and you may run into section 218 that we've referred to earlier because we can't cross too many boundary lines and no streets. But if it's a city block, hopefully there's no public streets, but it's still maybe 6 boundary lines. So one way or another, it may be difficult. The way that it's been done in California with some success, especially going way back to the Enron energy crisis in the early 2000s, was to form co-ops, micro co-ops, and they're allowed to do all those things for you, and it could still be done that way.
So another question, so recognition that private capital isn't the problem, technology isn't the problem, it's the speed, the pace of regulatory reform. Is that moving at the right pace? And we're focusing on California because, as Ali, mentioned really at the start, microgrids have been recognized both from a policy and a legislative position as, an important solution to the challenges the California economy has been facing recently, wildfires, et cetera, et cetera. How do we accelerate the pace of regulatory reform? Is it making, is it warp speed in track 2? Is that kind of what we need? I mean, we've all been sidelined, obviously, by, a pandemic, right? There's no getting around that. But how do we accelerate the pace?
Well, I think when it comes to our open proceeding at the PUC, let's get a decision on track 1 pretty soon. Like, let's try to keep that on track for June, and open the second track right away to address all the issues that we've laid out with the larger systems, the more sophisticated microgrids needing their challenges addressed as well, and creating the new microgrid tariff as the statute really says to do. I mean, I really think that the PUC has done some good things by improving interconnection for solar and storage, and improving the utility relations with local governments and CCAs. But that wasn't part of the bill. There's nothing in SB 1339 about any of those things. It says specifically to create a microgrid tariff. And if we can make significant progress on that in the next 6 months, we will have a lot of microgrids deployed in California before the 2021 fire season, which is really, a reasonable, achievable timeline for deploying projects of this sophistication at scale widely across the state.
And Rob, one thing I'll highlight is looking forward, it's really that track 2 focus, as Ali and Baird have said, on customer microgrids. But that's obviously not the exclusive focus that the Commission and all the various stakeholders have going forward. We believe it needs to be complemented by recognizing that to take advantage of microgrids that we need for resiliency and are capable of providing these dynamic, valuable competitive services to the grid, that utilities need to be encouraged to undertake substantial control investments, that the way that utilities are compensated needs to begin to be transferred more on an incentive and a performance-based approach. Through that transition period, we need to make sure that utilities have floors on their revenues so that they're able to go out there and source the capital from the markets that we need them to source to put in place these massive control technology investments. The bottom line is there's a lot for everybody to invest in and do to get us to the future that the legislature has laid out for the state. And so, we look forward to working with all of the various stakeholders to move the ball and help deliver on that more resilient, smarter, higher performing grid that we're all after.
And
yeah.
And I would just sort of argue that the reason why MRC has been so focused on California is that it really is sort of blue water, right? I mean, there is this convergence of urgency, necessity, economic, resiliency, and an informed, legislature and and a commission too that seems interested in microgrids as an innovation and as a so track 2 really does require. Track 2 is where the game is, right? I mean that's where we've got to increase muscle, increase involvement, increase voice, and really I think invest in vehicles like the MRC to kind of drive the discussion and support these policymakers and legislators who need help in I think solving these these interrelated technical, economic, and environmental challenges. So in the little bit of time left, one of the questions came up is this a zero-sum game that either you have a resiliency or environmental? Are there like inherent trade-offs that we need to balance better with longer run microgrids and carbon emissions? Our members have been doing it. Anyone care to comment there?
Yeah, Rob, I'll go quickly, and then I'm sure Baird has insights here. MRC has members that actually run their business rules and dispatch the resources within their microgrid on the basis of carbon intensity goals. And so, the sense that a mix of resources within the microgrid somehow creates a trade-off. We really do believe that microgrids offer one of the most efficient uses for gas generation. When done right, it allows for the characteristics of that generation, not only on a resiliency and a long duration standpoint, but on a fast response and ramping dynamic to be able to support more penetration of renewables in the grid system overall. Again, microgrids are unprecedented in their ability to act as kind of a dynamic shock absorber to export, to import, and everything in between. It is fairly impressive. So we don't see it, we see it being a reality that to have long run duration now, efficient use of cleaner gaseous fuels is certainly, a way to go. But as we talked about before, the future is shifting. We're seeing, for instance, the low carbon fuel standard in California drive the development of alternative cleaner fuels as well. And so, a future where the systems that we use now, you know, contain higher mixtures of hydrogen, higher mixtures of biomethane. There isn't an inherent trade-off, and you know, fundamentally, microgrids offer a nice bridge to the future, and because of their characteristics, you know, it really enables California to pursue resiliency, economic, and environmental goals in a concurrent fashion.
Baird,
I'll add briefly that you know, it really isn't a trade-out; it's a trade-off. It's a process.
Right.
You know, that we're evolving the grid, and the people who are innovating and evolving it fastest are the folks who are building the microgrids. And whereas the investment in a large gas-fired power plant at utility scale is a 30+ year investment, an investment in a microturbine or a fuel cell is a 10, maybe 15-year investment at most. And a lot of those are able to switch fuels when the new fuels are available. You know, fuel cells that can take hydrogen as soon as they have it to take. And you know, Princeton University actually got permitted to run biodiesel in their cogeneration turbine. You know, it's you know, the problem is that there's not really much of a supply, and in California, it's all going to the transportation sector, which needs it worse. So.
Well,
Yeah,
and they get paid a higher rec too, right? I mean,
yeah, right.
it's like a 3-to-1.
Yeah, right.
LCFS credit value, is a higher value proposition for
So, I mean, we're all seeing a cleaner grid, right? The electrical grid is definitely getting cleaner. We're outside of Boston. You know, it's markedly better. And some of our institutional members are, as Chris mentioned, actually, you know, evaluating the energy that they would produce in their microgrid against the grid, and you know, and it's really based on carbon, not price, or a combination thereof. You know, I mean, historically the model was, you know, make or buy based on price, but going forward, you know, it's going to be on carbon, and a lot of our institutional members are driven to reduce carbon. So. You know, we think that actually microgrids are really the key enabling technology to get to these things at scale, and we've seen it institutionally. We have a little bit of time left. There were a couple of questions related to COVID, you know, 19, and sort of the, you know, recognition that, you know, this pandemic has had, you know, just, you know, wrenching financial implications, right, for the public sector. There's no getting around that. So. How do communities think about deploying microgrids if there really is no public funding vehicle? Is it get the rules right and private capital will participate? You know, de-risk these solutions, and the technology and, you know, and partners will bring these assets to bear. I'd like to maybe conclude, if you could, like, how do we move the future? How do we move the dial here? In this post-COVID economy? Allie, and then others.
I think the single biggest thing now we've seen is, you know, like I mentioned with 1215 earlier, is that, yeah, there's no government funding coming anytime soon for things that aren't absolutely essential. You know, we would argue that resilient power is essential. I mean, we can't have running water without power. We can't have hospitals without power. Those things are all essential. But if we get the rules and the market mechanisms right, we will absolutely bring a lot of private capital to bear, and it will really have a multiplier effect where all of these facilities, if they're able to install microgrids that provide them with energy savings, then they'll be able to reinvest that savings in their operations, in the local economies. This stretches beyond just providing backup power at critical facilities. This is really a way to stimulate the economy. And I do truly think that if we remove departing load charges for microgrids, that is one of the biggest actions that the state could take as an economic stimulus without having to spend a dime of new money.
Right. So that alone would de-risk the market, and would actually like reverse the whole Sam Insel regulated model. You know, right? Like that alone could reinvent. I don't mean to be so flowery. Baird?
Well, Just a thought. California is one of the states that's leading in green bonds, but Delaware, where I work for the Sustainable Energy Utility, is another one. And we just sold $50 million worth of bonds earlier this morning for energy efficiency.
Right.
And the California statute for energy performance contracting, like many states, goes well beyond just what's energy efficiency, but includes renewable energy. And an awful lot of microgrids will come real close to paying for themselves or better and be eligible for energy performance contracting. And you can push that out for 20 or 30 years and communities can move forward.
Right. And there was a question. I do want to get to this because it has become a bit of a headwind, particularly in California, sort of a let's electrify everything, right? So let's electrify the buildings, so how do we create an environment where the recognition of thermal energy, is part of the planning process? It is, kind of recognized to enhance efficiency, resiliency, and even the, quality of connected buildings. Anyone care to sort of answer there?
I'll chime in on that one, and this goes along with that whatever folks have been saying. I mean, there are certain use applications for steam,
Hot water,
or hot water, or chilled water, or thermal, of thermal energy overall, that don't have good, electric
recognition,
options,
regulatory recognition.
But I would say, good options for production, cost-effective options currently. Now, a lot of folks are looking to develop those, but not everyone has good hot rock, for geothermal. Not everybody has the land space it needs to put up solar thermal, or the roof space because they have, say, PV up instead. There's restrictions there, and I think thermal has always been kind of the quiet energy, as it were. People don't realize, when they go into various campuses, buildings and such, how much of the HVAC, how much of the systems that they're accessing and using and so on are driven by thermal energy, and how thermal energy itself can also serve as a storage technology. There's great room for increased recognition of what it can do, and it's one of the many suites of technologies. To your last question, Rob, if governments have run out of money to build the microgrids that they need to help their communities be resilient, and if there are opportunities to remove barriers and streamline the regulatory frameworks, there is a ton of experienced, successful microgrid providers, vendors, developers, financiers, operators, asset managers, and folks out there who have great track records, who have again been very successful, who are ready to come in and offer solutions as a service through the contractual constructs that Baird was describing and others. And so thermal is one of those dynamics that does need better recognition. We have technologies that are in development right now. Folks are developing technologies that can avoid the need for hot rock, that can do that can address the thermal needs of applications. But fundamentally, when it comes down to how we get communities the resilient facilities they need, the microgrids they need at their critical facilities, the microgrid community is ready to offer that as a service when folks are ready to modernize and update regulatory frameworks.
Yeah, Rick Tice correctly points out that you don't need hot rocks. Our member, University of Missouri, their entire science and technology campus is running on geothermal heat pumps, and it's part of the wave of the future. But but it's part of the way we're going to electrify heat in a more efficient way than resistance heating.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our participants, and you know, we've actually extended beyond our planned time. The full webinar will be available on our website, www.microgridresources.com. Here's the contact information for all of our panelists. If you either would like to follow up with a kind of a question, an inquiry, you know, further conversation, this will be available to all participants. We'll be sending around a link to the webinar as streaming, and then the slides will be available in PDF format for all to use. So I'd like to thank Ali Detrio, Baird Brown, and Christopher Berent for making time for us today. And thank you all for your hard work in California and beyond. We still have a lot of work ahead of us. So finally, in concluding, I'd like to thank our sustaining sponsors who helped to underwrite both IDA's efforts at education and engagement and advocacy. So Clearway Energy, NG, Johnson Controls, Solar Turbines, Thermo Systems, and Train. You know, really all excellent organizations that are very much a part of the industry as it's evolving and competing and changing. And so thank you. And if you'd like to visit the IDA website, it's districtenergy.org. A lot of content there, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If anyone is interested in collaborating, working with, or becoming a member of the MRC, please reach out to us. We are always interested in additional voices, particularly in California, but beyond. There was a question about the Northeast. There is no shortage of challenge and opportunity as we look to evolve the energy industry we've all grown up with. We think it's time that you know, that innovation takes hold, and you know, we'd like to do it with the help of many of you on the call. So thank you, and again, be well and keep up the good work. Bye for now.
Take care.